In our second breakout of this presentation, we're going to be talking a little bit about the differences in expenses and how you classify that. As a reminder, we talked about direct programmatic expenses, indirect or administrative expenses, and capital campaign expenses. And with that in mind, considering the funding types we talked about, some of the ambiguities we've discussed, like how to exactly break down direct versus admin expenses, what do you see as the greatest opportunities for your organization in the next year? What are the risks and challenges that might arise from pursuing multiple funding streams at once? How can you prepare internally in terms of staffing, policies, procedures, check-ins, so that you can mitigate these challenges? And who in your organization or network can help you navigate new funding opportunities and some of the challenges that you will be discussing in the forum space? Asia, any thoughts like on this breakdown or just some of the challenges that pop up in trying to calculate that?
No, absolutely. I think some of the challenges that I've seen in this line of work is people not being as specific as they can in terms of those itemized lists, right? Later in the course, we'll definitely get into budgets and how to really break that down, part of the grant writing process. But oftentimes when you are implementing a program because your nonprofit's mission is to just serve people, right? If we take away like the bells and whistles of like what type of support you're giving, at times nonprofits will fall into that rabbit hole of just thinking about people and not translating that into items that are not only you're providing to people, but also from a funder's standpoint, they are looking for the breakdown. And so it's a very capitalistic mindset,
Mm-hmm.
if you will. And with capitalism, it's not all negative. There is a positive component to it if implemented in the right way, meaning what are the exact ingredients that you need to execute whatever the project may be. So, for example, when we're talking about food pantries in particular, if there is an instance, like Anthony mentioned earlier in our other breakout, about a building that you may be putting together or a new pantry that you want to start, it's not just a matter of that specific venue space, right? What do you need to actualize that building? Breaking it down super niche, all the way down to the lights, to the flooring, not just staff, right? Again, think in terms of product, food, who's going to be the supplier? Are you able to track and monitor some of the best costs for that supplier that you may be purchasing from, because you may be able to find some of those affordability components where you're doing the proper market research for it. But again, those challenges that I've seen a lot in this line of work is people not being as specific, nonprofits not being as streamlined in their process as they can be in terms of itemized listing.
Agree. And that's a great point on like the material side of things, especially with the capital campaign. I would add to that the time and like the time allocation. I think of like the executive director of an agency where, executive director has his or her fingers on the pulse. They're doing management. They're probably rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty too. But they're also doing like fundraising, board engagement, stakeholder, funder engagement. And, if you're able to really break down how people are spending their time, you can just show your math to a funder where,
Yes.
let's say your executive director is spending, 40% of their time, doing fundraising. So you would break down that salary where the 40% is more on the admin side of things, 60% for the direct services side of things. And, that's really, every organization is different, like we talked about. Every staffing makeup is different, people wearing multiple hats. So it's really on you to decide what that breakdown is. But if a funder comes asking, you just want to be able to show your math. You want to be able to say, this is why we calculated it. Obviously, some weeks are going to be crazier than others. Folks are not always working 40-hour weeks, but we can
Right.
say with confidence, this is how we break this down so that every dollar that you're supporting for our staff, we can say that 80% of that is going to direct services overall with the agency. And I think that comes down to financial management. It comes down to compliance. It comes down to tracking what those expenses look like and people's individuals' time.
Absolutely. And what's also coming to mind right now for me is contingency
Mhm.
as well. Like, we talked a lot about these different costs, whether they're indirect or they're super direct, but also understanding inflation plays a role too, right? So again, just drilling down on the initiative element of it as a nonprofit, whether you're in a leadership position at your nonprofit or not, being able to introduce the fact that may need to prepare for additional costs if anything comes up that you didn't, consider when you first were putting together those costs. Because yes, the math has to math, it has to make sense to the funders that you're giving it to, but the funders are also looking for nonprofits that are keeping in mind that contingency or that plan B as well. And what would that plan B be for? And once we get kind of further into this course in the modules, we'll talk a little bit about logic modules because of what makes sense as to how you want to present the different inputs and outputs. But for the most part, contingency planning is really coming to me with that regard too. And best practice on that is 10 to 15% of your overall budget of what it is you're preparing for as a nonprofit.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think especially in volatile periods in terms of funding, every administration when they come in have their own different focuses, have a lot of authority in terms of like what agencies like the USDA, EPA will be offering. It's always good to have that diversity of funders, like we had mentioned previously. But in terms of what the greatest opportunities, might be for an agency, I think about how at the bottom, kind of the easy, low-hanging fruit are those programmatic grants that we were talking about in the last breakout, sponsorships, in-kinds. I feel those are the easiest kind of appeals because you can show that direct engagement, whether it's an in-kind contribution from a funder. You can make that case a little bit stronger that their funding is going to support efforts in the community. And then sponsorships, that's that face time that you're giving to the community. That's a great way to give some value for that sponsorship, but also showing the sponsors that like, hey, we're out there. We're not just rolling out our services, but we're also engaging other folks and other stakeholders in the community coming in. And then once you kind of curate those relationships, then you can climb up to the higher levels of general operating support and make that a little bit easier to get the capital campaigns as well. So especially with a little bit of the uncertainty that we're seeing right now, I would highly recommend looking for those programmatic grants where you can really get your foot in the door for new funders or just strengthen that relationship with existing funders and say like, hey, we're here. We're going to pick up the slack. If government funding is going through a little bit of a dry spell, we're going to make sure that this community is fed. We're going to make sure that people aren't going hungry in this community because we keep our doors open no matter what.
Absolutely, and I think also banding together as community as well for some of those programmatic grants that Anthony is referring to, looking towards other nonprofits or either other key partners within your community, right? It doesn't have to be nonprofit to nonprofit. You also have other opportunities to collaborate with folks in your community so that we are spreading the resources in a balanced nature in terms of allocation, because that's also one of the challenges that I've seen in this line of work as well, as far as taking on that burden, right, with pride. And we love a good grassroots organization that will say that they can just take it all on their own and have the rewarding feeling of it at the end of the day. However, in this changing climate and ecosystem that we all are a part of in this moment, it is important for us to lean on one another and also share those resources in that capacity so that we all are still working towards that general overall mission, because the funders do that as well. They lean on one another and they have meetings with themselves as far as who they're giving to, who, if anybody has any updates on what nonprofits that have already been successful. And so on the nonprofit side of things, we also have to take the onus and do that as well within our nonprofit circles and networks.
Definitely. And I think we've talked a lot about kind of the stakeholders who are a little bit detached from organizations. So we've talked about board members, we've talked about, tapping into your funder network. And I just want to also underline that, folks who are on the front lines in your organization have a lot of institutional knowledge and have a lot of lived experience either themselves or that they're witnessing firsthand every day in the community. And I just want to emphasize that including those folks in the applications is really key. They can say, what their needs are, what they're seeing in the community. And when it comes to volunteering, those are your ambassadors working with funders, stakeholders, et cetera. Of course, you're probably going to have your executive director or some other administrative staff there, but it's really those folks who are serving the meals, giving out the food, who are a representation of your organization and the kindness, the empathy, the level of service that one can expect from your organization. So always make sure you're activating your organization top to bottom. And just thinking about the nonprofit management aspect, this gives folks learning opportunities, room to grow within your agency, not pigeonholing folks to just be a direct service provider, but show them like this, give them some autonomy with the agency, having them understand a little bit about how the agency funds itself, what allows it to tick, and giving them some ownership. You never know who's going to step up if you don't give them the opportunity.
Absolutely, and I think that makes for an excellent practice within nonprofit management when it comes to those audits that happen as well. Because if you have some of the direct service members that are part of your organization giving you feedback on whether or not you have the correct amount of quantity that you're planning for financially, because they're the ones that's giving it out. They see how quickly it's going and how much more they may have wished that they had in that moment for that program or that event activation. And so just doubling down on what Anthony mentioned about including them into that process, just to maybe look over a section of the grant, right? Because we also don't want to take away what their scope is at the organization as well. Because I've also seen that a lot as well in terms of, burnout. And prior to even getting into grant writing, that's part of my lived experience as well. And so thinking back in hindsight, as much as I loved being a part of those conversations, it still was taking away energy from what I actually was hired to do. And so I think that we're just in a unique situation, especially with this course, to just help some of you that are in nonprofits understand that lens as well of the things that you're asking of your support staff.
Yeah, that's a great point. When I was working my way up at the organization I was at, I had a semicolon in my job title at one point to avoid that. Everyone's already working too many jobs as it is. So I think that's a great point. Like having the appropriate level of interaction, for the individual and making sure that they don't feel like they're just getting something scooped on top of their full-time job, but doing so in a way that is empathetic, acknowledges and empowers, rather than extracting or just trying to squeeze some more water from that stone.
Absolutely. I call it the check the box mentality. Try to steer away from that a little bit, because with the work that you do as a nonprofit in terms of addressing food insecurity and all the things that come along with that, yes, we're talking about food insecurity in this course, but we know that there's also byproducts of that as well that bleed over into homelessness, that bleed over into public health issues. And so that intersection in and of itself, being mindful to kind of, again, look at it from an iterative standpoint, meaning in phases and milestones. And when we get later in the course in a couple of the weeks, you'll definitely be able to engage with that content and see some of those strategies and approaches that we're talking about to make sure that there's a healthy balance in not only finding the right opportunities for your nonprofit, but making sure that you're grant ready and you also are just very niche down in what it is that you're providing and what you're asking funders for.